The man arrived in the village one crisp autumn evening, just as the last rays of the sun cast long shadows across the fields. No one saw him arrive. One moment the streets were empty and the next there he was, walking slowly through the center of town, his old boots scuffing the cobblestones with a soft, unsettling rhythm. He carried a weathered leather bag slung over his shoulder, its contents unknown and the weight of it making him stoop as he walked. No one knew where he had come from, but everyone noticed him. In a village as small and quiet as ours, strangers didn't simply appear. There were no trains, no buses, no convenient ways in or out, unless you knew the old forest trails that led through the mountains. And yet, this man seemed to have walked right out of the past, his ancient clothing hanging in layers on his bony frame, his gray beard thick and wild, like tangled roots creeping over his gaunt face. He moved slowly, but there was a quiet strength in the way he carried himself, as though time had worn him down but hadn't broken him. We didn't say anything to him. No one did. We just watched. We were a small, close-knit community. Outsiders rarely passed through, and when they did, they usually didn't stay long. The old man, however, made it clear from the moment he set foot in the village that he wasn't just passing through. He was settling in. He chose the old house at the edge of the village, the one that had been abandoned for years after the last family who lived there had left. No one went near it, not since the terrible accident that had claimed their lives. The house itself was an ancient thing as old as the village, perhaps older. Its stone walls were crumbling, and its windows were little more than dark, empty eyes staring out at the world. We watched from a distance as the old man moved in. No one offered to help. Something about him unnerved us. Maybe it was the way he never looked anyone directly in the eye. Or maybe it was the story some of the older villagers whispered under their breath, stories of men like him who wandered from distant lands, carrying with them old secrets and ancient curses. Whatever the reason, we kept our distance. The first few days after his arrival were quiet. The old man hardly left the house, though we could sometimes see him through the cracked windows, moving about inside, tending to the hearth or fixing broken furniture. Occasionally, late at night, someone passing by would hear strange sounds coming from inside, soft, rhythmic chants, like some kind of prayer spoken in a language none of us understood. But no one dared to investigate. The first time I saw him up close, I was delivering milk to the old well. I had grown up in the village, had walked that same path every morning since I was a boy. The path took me past his house, and as I walked by, I saw him standing on the porch, staring out at the fields with those dark, distant eyes. He didn't move when I passed. He didn't even seem to notice me at first. But as I reached the edge of his property, I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned and there he was, watching me. His eyes, black and sunken, met mine for just a moment. It wasn't anger or hostility I saw in his gaze, but something far worse. It was like looking into the eyes of a man who had lived too long, seen too much. A man who carried the weight of centuries on his shoulders. I froze, unable to move, unable to look away. His gaze pinned me where I stood, and in that moment the world seemed to grow silent. No birds, no wind, just the two of us standing there in the fading light. Then, as quickly as it had happened, the moment passed. He blinked and the spell was broken. I hurried on, my heart pounding in my chest, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that house as possible. From that day on, the village began to change. People talked less. The streets felt emptier, even though everyone was still there, going about their lives. It was as though the old man's presence had cast a shadow over the whole place, a shadow that grew darker with each passing day. No one would speak of it openly, but I knew the others felt it too. There was a tension in the air, a heaviness that settled over us like a blanket, suffocating and cold. Then, strange things started happening. The first was small. A dog went missing. Old Mrs. Mackey's collie, a friendly thing that never wandered far from home. One morning it was just gone. She searched the village, calling its name, but no one had seen it. She told me later, when I helped her carry water from the well, that she'd heard it barking late at night, its frantic yelps echoing through the quiet streets. But when she'd looked outside, there was nothing. Just the darkness. The next incident was harder to ignore. One of the children, a little girl named Lily, claimed she'd seen the old man in the woods at night. She'd been playing near the edge of the forest when she spotted him standing among the trees, watching her. She said he hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but she felt him staring at her, even from a distance. Her father, a burly man with little patience for nonsense, scolded her for making up stories, but I could see the worry in his eyes. More and more, people began to whisper about the old man. They said he was a sorcerer, a man of dark magic who had come to our village with wicked intent. Some of the older women even claimed he was responsible for the strange deaths that had occurred years ago, when the family in the old house had perished under mysterious circumstances. But no one dared confront him. No one dared even speak his name aloud. He became the unspoken curse of the village. Every night, I would lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and groans of the house settling. And every night, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I would hear it, faint, almost too soft to notice. A sound like chanting carried on the wind. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. I wasn't the only one hearing it, though. One night at the pub, I overheard two men talking in low voices, their faces pale as they described the same sound, the rhythmic, haunting chant that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And always, it seemed to come from the direction of the old man's house. There was something wrong with him. Something more than just the strangeness of a man who didn't belong. Something deeper, darker, lurking beneath the surface. I could feel it in my bones, in the way the very air seemed to shiver when he passed. The villagers had started avoiding the old house entirely. No one walked that path anymore, and those who lived nearby had begun closing their shutters early, as though trying to shut out the presence that now loomed over the village like a storm cloud. The fields closest to his house had withered, the crops turning brown and brittle, as if the land itself was rejecting him. And yet no one dared to act. No one confronted him. We just watched in silence as the darkness gathered around him like a storm waiting to break. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be long before something happened. Something terrible. I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers, the shadows, the weight of everything unsaid hung over the village like a curse. It had been weeks since the old man arrived, weeks since the air turned thick with tension, since the strange happenings started. Every night, I lay in bed, my skin crawling, my mind racing with images of those hollow, empty eyes staring out from the darkened house at the edge of the village. That night, the air felt different, heavier, more suffocating. Even before I left my house, something told me it was a bad idea, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed answers. I needed to know what was happening, what was lurking behind that man's cold gaze, and why everything felt wrong since he had come. So, after the sun set and the village had settled into an uneasy quiet, I grabbed my coat, a flashlight, and set out toward the old man's house. The streets were empty. Not a single soul dared to venture out after dark these days. The windows of every house were tightly shuttered, lights extinguished as though everyone was too afraid to draw attention to themselves. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the cobblestones as I made my way to the edge of the village, my heart pounding louder with every step. The closer I got to the old man's house, the more the world seemed to shift. The air around me grew colder and the smell, like rotting earth, damp and decayed, drifted through the breeze. The trees, once vibrant and full of life, were now bare, their branches twisted like gnarled fingers, reaching for something unseen. The silence was deafening, the kind that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. I reached the front gate and paused, staring at the decrepit house before me. The windows were dark, but I could feel it, something inside, something watching. The wind rustled through the overgrown weeds, and for a moment, I thought I heard it again. That low, rhythmic chanting like a distant hum, crawling up from the very ground beneath me. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. My fingers gripped the gate, the metal cold against my skin. Just look around, I told myself. You don't even have to go inside. Just look. But even as I said the words, I knew they were lies. Some part of me, deep down, had already committed to whatever madness awaited me beyond the threshold. As I pushed open the gate and stepped into the yard, the world seemed to close in around me. The air was colder here, as though the house itself was drawing the warmth out of the world. I glanced around, scanning the overgrown bushes and broken stone walls, but nothing moved. It was dead, lifeless, just like the man who lived here. My feet carried me up the crumbling path to the front door. It was slightly ajar, the wood warped and splintered as though it had been left to rot for decades. I hesitated, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the door frame. For a long moment I stood there, my mind screaming at me to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But something else pulled me forward. Something darker, something curious. I stepped inside. The smell hit me first, damp, musty, like mold that had festered in the dark for far too long. The air was thick with dust, swirling in the faint beam of my flashlight as I shone it around the front hall. The floor creaked underfoot, and the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, streaked with grime and something that looked suspiciously like dried blood. My stomach churned, but I pressed on. The house felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl. Every shadow seemed to twist and warp, moving just out of the corner of my eye. The sound of my own breathing echoed too loudly in the silence, and I found myself straining to hear anything, any movement, any sign of life. But there was nothing. Only the faint thrum of that damn chanting growing louder with every step I took. I ventured deeper into the house, my flashlight flickering slightly as if something was draining the energy from it. The living room was just as decrepit as the hall. Old furniture draped in torn, yellowing sheets, a fireplace filled with ash that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But there was something wrong. A feeling, an overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. I turned the corner into the next room and froze. There, in the center of the floor, was a circle. A perfect, blood-red circle, painted with strange symbols I couldn't recognize. Candles, half-burnt and melted, lined the edges of the circle, their wax dripping down onto the wooden floor like congealed blood. But it wasn't the circle that made my blood run cold, it was the thing in the center. A doll. No, not a doll. A figure made of straw and cloth, its head fashioned out of what looked like an old burlap sack. Its body was twisted and misshapen, its arms bent at unnatural angles, and its face was stitched into a grotesque smile. Black thread had sewn the mouth into a wide, terrifying grin, but the eyes, they were real. Human eyes, glistening wet and staring blankly at the ceiling, embedded into the burlap face as though they had been ripped from someone's skull. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight as bile rose in my throat. My vision swam, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I had to get out. I had to leave. Whatever this was, this nightmare, I didn't want to be a part of it. I turned to run, but before I could take a single step, I felt it. A presence behind me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, so slowly, I turned around. The old man stood in the doorway, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the floor. His eyes, those black hollow eyes, were locked on me, unblinking, emotionless. His lips moved, forming words that I couldn't hear, but I knew he was speaking. Chanting. The same eerie, rhythmic chanting I had heard every night since he arrived. I took a step back, my entire body trembling. I didn't mean to, I stammered, but the words died in my throat. He smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, but something darker, something that didn't belong on a human face. His teeth were sharp, too sharp, and yellowed with age. He took a step forward and I felt my legs turn to lead, rooting me to the spot. You saw too much, he said in a voice like gravel grinding against stone. It was soft, almost kind, but beneath it I could feel the threat. The finality. I opened my mouth to scream, to beg, but before I could make a sound, his hand shot out from under his tattered cloak. In one fluid motion he jabbed a syringe into my neck. I gasped, feeling the cold metal bite into my skin. My vision blurred, the edges of my world darkening as something icy flooded my veins. I stumbled, my legs giving out beneath me. The room spun violently, the old man's figure warping and twisting as the darkness closed in. My breath came in ragged, shallow gasps, and my body felt impossibly heavy, sinking into the floor. The last thing I saw was his face, looming above me, smiling that terrible, hollow smile as everything went black. The last thing I heard was his voice, soft and whispering as the darkness swallowed me whole. You belong to me now.